If you hold any amount of XRP, even a tiny stack, what I'm about to explain to you changes the entire way you look at your position. Because something has quietly begun behind the scenes. Something that a former World Bank liquidity architect described as a global liquidity reset. Not a theory, not a prediction, a structural event already in motion. One that will force financial markets, settlement networks, and cross-border payment flows to realign in ways most people are not prepared for. Welcome back to Matrix Millionaire. Before we dive into the core of this, hit like so this reaches as many XRP holders as possible. Subscribe if you refuse to sleep through the biggest shift in modern finance, and drop a comment telling me how long you've been holding XRP. And as always, this is information, not financial advice. Crypto moves quickly, markets shift fast, and you are responsible for your own decisions. Right now, as I'm recording this, XRP is trading in the low double-digit cent range, still, quiet, almost emotionless. Retail looks at that and sees stagnation. But the World Bank architect explained that this kind of stillness is not normal. It's the same type of liquidity compression that appears right before major settlement systems adjust the way money moves. He said something that hit me instantly. Liquidity doesn't reset when markets are loud. It resets when markets are quiet. Think about that. The loud phases are for retail. The quiet phases are for infrastructure. When you see an asset as globally connected as XRP become still, while the macro system undergoes stress, it's not a coincidence. It's alignment. He described the current financial environment as the end of one liquidity era and the beginning of another. Bond markets are strained. Global payment rails are outdated. Tokenization is accelerating far faster than central banks anticipated. And cross-border settlement, the backbone of the world economy, is being forced into modernization ahead of schedule. That modernization requires a neutral settlement asset, a bridge asset, something fast, liquid, borderless, and not controlled by any single government. And the architect made it clear. The institutions preparing for the liquidity reset are focusing on assets that solve settlement friction, not assets with hype cycles. This is where XRP enters the picture. Not because of price, not because of influencers, not because of news cycles, but because of functionality. He explained that financial resets always begin with liquidity migration. Before rails change, capital flows change. Before capital flows change, liquidity conditions tighten. And before liquidity conditions tighten, the smartest desks in the world reposition into assets that will matter in the next system, not the current one. That's the retention spike, because what he said next exposes everything happening right now. XRP isn't moving because the system around it is moving. It's not lagging, it's sinking. Sinking. That word explains everything. The low volatility, the tightening depth, the clustering wallets, and the silent behavior across corridors in Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. XRP isn't asleep. It's synchronizing with the liquidity architecture that is being built behind the scenes. The architect pointed out that when the global monetary system resets liquidity flows, and it will, assets that reduce friction become indispensable. XRP reduces friction in cross-border settlement, liquidity sourcing, and tokenized transfers. In a liquidity reset, assets like that don't follow the market. The market follows them. He said the hardest part for retail to accept is that the reset doesn't look dramatic at first. It looks boring. It looks sideways. It looks like nothing. But underneath that nothingness, capital shifts, depth tightens, supply contracts, corridors calibrate. And by the time the visible phase arrives, the reset is already well underway. If you hold any amount of XRP, you're not just holding a coin. You're holding a position inside the first stages of a global liquidity transformation, one that starts quietly and then suddenly becomes undeniable. To understand why holding any amount of XRP matters right now, you need to understand the mechanism behind what the World Bank liquidity architect called a global liquidity reset. Because this reset is not a conspiracy, not a dramatic overnight event, and not something retail traders can see on a price chart. It is a slow, structural redirection of how money moves across borders, a redirection already in motion. He explained that the world has entered a phase where traditional liquidity channels no longer work the way they were designed to. Bond markets are destabilizing. Foreign exchange reserves are shifting. Central banks are quietly preparing for tokenized currencies, and global settlement flows, the real plumbing of the financial world, are being squeezed harder than they have in decades. The architect said the reset begins when the existing rails can no longer support the volume being forced through them. Settlement delays increase. Liquidity becomes expensive. Capital gets trapped in nostro accounts. And the cost of cross-border money movement rises at the exact moment the world is digitizing value at high speed. That is the breaking point, when liquidity must be rerouted. This is where XRP becomes more than a speculative asset. It becomes a solution. He said that before any global settlement rail transitions, the system enters what he called pre-alignment. This is the phase where liquidity sources adjust quietly, where cross-border corridors test new rails without public announcements, and where assets designed for real-time settlement begin migrating away from exchanges and into long-term storage. Look at XRP's on-chain behavior right now. Liquidity tightening, clustered accumulation, long-term wallets activating, and corridor-specific addresses absorbing supply. This is exactly what pre-alignment looks like. The architect said that during a liquidity reset, two things happen to the assets that will matter in the next system. 1. Their visible price stagnates. 2. Their invisible importance increases. Retail sees the first. Institutional desks see the second. Because in a reset, price is the last thing to move. Utility is the first. And that's the part almost every retail trader misses. Liquidity resets do not start with price spikes. They start with liquidity compression. That means supply begins quietly contracting. Depth thins. Markets flatten. But the system underneath is rewiring. He explained that as tokenized bonds, tokenized cash, and cross-border CBDCs begin to scale, the settlement layer becomes the choke point of the entire system. If settlement is slow, everything breaks. If settlement is expensive, everything slows. If settlement cannot bridge between currencies instantly, tokenization becomes useless. This is why any XRP, literally any amount, becomes valuable in the next era. Because the system will not ask for your emotional confirmation. It will not warn retail. It will not wait for hype. It will shift out of necessity. And when necessity forces settlement onto real-time rails, assets that enable that shift are repriced accordingly, not because of speculation, but because of systemic demand. The architect said something that perfectly explains XRP's current moment. Liquidity resets aren't about markets choosing new assets. They're about old systems making new assets unavoidable. That line is the entire script distilled into one truth. You aren't holding XRP because the market loves it right now. You're holding XRP because the system will need it soon. And by the time the world understands that, the reset will already be in motion, because technically, it has already begun. The architect said something that hit harder than anything else in the conversation, something most retail investors will never hear. By the time the public realizes a liquidity reset has happened, the system has already been using the new rails for months. That one sentence explains everything happening around XRP right now. The stillness, the silence, the sideways price action, the thinning sell-side depth, the clustering wallets, the corridor footprints in Asia and the Middle East, the sudden lack of noise coming from Ripple. This is not stagnation. This is preparation. The liquidity reset is not coming. It has started. You can feel it not by looking at price, but by looking at behavior. Markets sleep. Institutions wake. Retail leaves. Infrastructure loads. This is the exact sequence that always appears before a recalibration and global settlement. And here's the part that most people won't understand until it's far too late. Liquidity resets don't elevate assets because of hype. They elevate assets because the old system no longer works. When settlement friction becomes unbearable, when tokenized value needs a neutral bridge, when global payments need real-time movement, the market doesn't choose the asset. The system does. It chooses what works. It chooses what is already integrated. It chooses what is already tested. It chooses what is already neutral, scalable, and trusted. It chooses what fills the gap the old world created. That is why holding any amount of XRP is not insignificant. It is positioning. It is foresight. It is being aligned with the system before the crowd wakes up. Because once the visible phase begins, once headlines start covering tokenized bonds, CBDC corridors, ODL expansion, and cross-border rails flipping to real-time, the repricing will not feel gentle. It will feel sudden, but it was never sudden. It started here, in the quiet, in the compression, in the liquidity reset nobody noticed except the few who actually pay attention to the system instead of the chart. If you're holding any amount of XRP, even 50, even 20, even 10, you're holding something the world will need whether it believes it today or not. You are inside the shift, not outside of it. And if you made it to the end of this video, I want you to comment one single word so I know you're one of the few who sees what's happening beneath the surface. Reset. That one word tells me you stayed till the final second. It tells the algorithm you're part of the awake minority, and it tells the world you understand the difference between noise and signals. Tap like so more XRP holders see the truth. Subscribe to Matrix Millionaire so you never miss what's coming next. And comment reset right now. The silence isn't the end. It's the beginning. The liquidity reset has started, and you're early.